In part 3, I want to tell you some of what I take away from Buchanan's idea of constitutional political economy. I will also tell you how these ideas can be a part of this course. Buchanan's idea of constitutional political economy shows us that there is a fundamental conceptual difference between the constitutional stage and the post-constitutional stage of social interaction. At the constitutional stage, people agree to property rights. The post-constitutional stage of social interaction involves the actions of daily life. In the post-constitutional stage, the property rights agreed to in the constitutional stage are traded. Most of economics studies only the post-constitutional stage, and unfortunately, not noticing the conceptual distinction between these two stages often leads, in my view, to conceptual mistakes about property rights. It is useful to follow Buchanan and see the Constitution as a contract which is agreed to voluntarily in the constitutional stage of social interaction. I think it is especially important to follow Buchanan's analysis and understand government as emerging from the constitutional stage of social interaction. It emerges because individuals see government as a means by which they can pursue their own personal projects. For example, it is a means of enforcing the constitutional stage agreement about property rights. There is no government purpose independent of the purposes of the individuals who choose to make the protective state, and perhaps the productive state, the means by which they pursue personal projects. As a result of studying Buchanan's constitutional political economy, I've come to see just how much mutual agreement and unanimity can be a part of even the post-constitutional stage of social interactions, even social interactions in government. Let's look at this possibility. Clearly, the world of exchange, the world of voluntary pairwise social interactions, is a world characterized by unanimity. And perhaps the far largest part of our daily lives involves social interactions we can characterize as voluntary. Must we give up the principle of mutual agreement in social interactions when we consider shared consumption, when we consider government? Perhaps not. Many shared consumption goods are club goods. That is, there is non-rival consumption with exclusion being possible. If exclusion is possible, then it may well be the case that such goods can be enjoyed through voluntary social interaction, that is, without the productive state. One illustration would be homeowners associations. They exist to provide shared consumption. Participation in an HOA may seem involuntary at times, but they really do involve the voluntary acceptance of a contract. Golf often takes place at private country clubs. The golf course is a shared consumption good. Clearly, the shared consumption good of a golf course does not require the productive state. Consider also that there are many golf courses that are provided by local governments. These are often called municipal courses. Still, a club good is involved. It is a government-provided club good. Education, fishing, mass transportation are other examples of shared consumption goods. They are also examples of club goods. Exclusion is possible. And we can observe in the real world examples of both privately provided as well as publicly provided illustrations in each of these areas. Clearly, such shared consumption can be accomplished without the productive state, and thus through voluntary social interactions in the post-constitutional stage. But here's another important observation. When government provides fishing, mass transport, and golf courses, government tends to also charge user fees. For example, in order to fish in Colorado, a person has to purchase a Colorado state government license to fish. For most of the history of state government game and fish agencies, the agency budget was determined entirely by the license revenue taken in. If an agency relies on user fees and relies on not $1 of tax revenue, then government provision would seem to be consistent with voluntary interactions. Thus, it would be consistent with unanimity, with mutual agreement. Many government activities can function without tax revenue. If they do, then they really seem to function by mutual agreement. Complaints in actual government circumstances tend to arise when the issue involves use of tax revenue. An illustration might be with the public schools. There are other aspects of government that also seem to fit pretty well with the principle of mutual agreement. For example, basing government on principles of federalism will allow government's use of force in ways that seem to minimize departures from mutual agreement. What does federalism mean? It is like the U.S. government on paper. There are 50 different governments, and there are far more local governments. This makes it possible for a person to decide local government actions could be improved upon, and thus the person might move to another political jurisdiction. My illustration today is Portland. I discovered a few years ago that state and local government had policies that had the following consequence for one homeowner. The homeowner's house burned down, destroyed. The homeowner wanted to rebuild. Government said, "No, you may not rebuild a single-family residence. You must rebuild a multi-family building instead." Such tyranny, I used to say to myself. Now, with Buchanan in mind, I still note the tyranny in such government action, but I also realize that over time, people who dislike the local government policies can sell their property and leave. Over time, others move to Portland knowing these policies. Over time, people vote with their feet to accept or decline, voluntarily, the local government. This is why federalism means more mutual agreement with government rather than less. Another feature of government that can encourage mutual agreement is to say that the rules the legislature imposes must apply in the same way to every person. Such rules would mean one could not determine beforehand which people would be disadvantaged by the rule. Such circumstances would mean wide agreement was possible because few would know they would be later disadvantaged by the rule. This might be a silly illustration, but who would disagree to the rule that murder is a crime? Perhaps only a person who had been planning a murder prior to passage of the rule. We can even notice that once in a while people in Congress don't much disagree. In principle, we might say such circumstances were consistent with the principle of mutual agreement. But you say, "Larry, aren't you paying attention? It seems like every issue in Washington leads these days to disagreement among politicians and among the people." Well, I say, didn't you notice the recent action in Congress regarding the Russia sanctions bill? Guess what? 99% of the votes cast in Congress on that bill were yes. That's congressional unanimity. The opposite of the Russia sanctions bill is the illustration of the Affordable Care Act. It passed both houses of Congress by pretty much the barest majority. It looks pretty much like the opposite of mutual agreement. So, if one only looks at the Affordable Care Act, one might say mutual agreement is not possible in government. But if you consider all the illustrations I have just provided, I say that you should agree with me. That conclusion is wrong. Even in government, it is possible to function with a great deal of mutual agreement. And I can add yet one more thought about mutual agreement in government. We should not forget the idea of compensation. You can perhaps understand compensation by thinking about an exchange. Say, I take your laptop from you. That sounds like theft. But suppose I compensate you for the loss of your laptop. That is, you said you would take $150 for it, and I gave you $150. You were, in a sense, compensated for losing your laptop. But this is also an illustration of exchange and thus an illustration of mutual agreement. The same principle can be utilized in politics and thus in government. Perhaps a proposal in Congress doesn't yet have a majority. The proponents might offer to add to the proposal in order to garner more votes. This can function like compensation. But to make compensation sound more like mutual agreement, or perhaps consensus, we would want to see the agreements garner well beyond a simple majority. And all of these ideas about mutual agreement with respect to governance and shared consumption goods can also take place within the context of constitutionalism, understood to be like Buchanan's constitutional political economy. As such, if actual government functions within the rules provided by the Constitution, we have yet another way to conceptually understand government in terms of mutual agreement. Of course, this also implies departures from the rules in the Constitution by actual people in government would seem to be very troubling. Let's talk about how Buchanan's ideas might be useful for this course. Buchanan suggests, based on his conceptual analysis, that the constitutional contract should embody a number of types of rules. Rules regarding behavior and social interactions, rules regarding rights of possession or property rights, rules about the operation and limits of the protective state, and rules about the operation and limits of the productive state. So over the course of the semester, we might wonder to what extent we can find these elements in the U.S. Constitution. Buchanan himself suggested there were significant missing elements. Specifically, he encouraged us to think the Constitution was missing a fiscal constitution, or it was missing specific rules about the power to tax and its limits, as well as rules requiring a balanced budget amendment. We might find that Buchanan's conceptual insights about differences between the protective state and the productive state may help clarify issues and disagreements related to court opinions. Buchanan also wrote, his task, the economist, is that of diagnosing social situations and presenting to the choosing individuals a set of possible changes. He does not recommend policy A over policy B. He presents policy A as a hypothesis subject to testing. The conceptual test is consensus among members of the choosing group, not objective improvement in some measurable social aggregate. We might follow Buchanan's suggestion. We should wonder if there are possible constitutional amendments to reduce rent-seeking, to improve performance of fiscal governance, to return constitutionalism to meaning constrained government.